Welcome to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Columbus. Our guest in this edition is U.S. Air Force veteran John McCarney. He served 4 years in the Air Force and was stationed at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines at the time of Operation Babylift, the effort to rescue children in South Vietnam from the communist North Vietnamese forces. As it became clear, Saigon would fall. And for 40 years after leaving the service, Mr. McCarney struggled with survivor's guilt because he was not on the ill-fated first flight of children from Vietnam to the Philippines. And John, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Where were you born and raised, sir?
I was born in Dayton, Ohio, ironically on an Air Force base, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I stayed there until I was 6 months old, and then my dad was transferred to Castle Air Force Base in Northern California, Merced, which I don't think is there anymore. And from there down, he was transferred to Norton Air Force Base in San Bernardino. And after that, he had a career in aerospace industry, and we kind of just followed wherever those jobs led to.
How many years did your dad spend in the service?
He was during World War II, so I think it was about four or 5 years. I think he was technically in the Army Air Corps before it was actually became the Air Force in 1947 or whenever it was there.
Right.
So.
Okay. You were a very good football player and went to the University of Oregon to continue your football. What position did you play?
Well, I was recruited there by John Robinson, who the coach that eventually went on to USC as a wide receiver. But he left, and they had a big coaching change, and they tried to put me at tight end, which I didn't really want to do, and I had some emotional issues at the time. So I was there for a little over a year, and then something stirred inside of me wanting to do something else. So I moved on.
And how did that lead to you joining the Air Force?
After I left the school, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I came back down to Southern California, was where I was from, and just things churned inside of me where I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I always felt like all I was a football player my whole life. And I actually went by a recruiting station and decided to go in, and I think subconsciously I went into the Air Force one because my dad had been in the Air Force, and I qualified for different specialties, and I think subconsciously I chose medical corpsman because my mom was a registered nurse. I think that's what kind of precipitated that. And I scored really high. So that's how I actually went in and ended up going down to Lackland Air Force Base for my basic training.
What was that like?
That was interesting. I kind of wanted to just bury myself as just an average guy within my flight and stuff, but my drill instructor chose me to be the dorm chief in charge of everybody when he wasn't there, which I didn't want to embrace at first because you had everybody from all over and I'm in charge and stuff, and that was a very interesting experience. The physical part and everything wasn't anything difficult or even the discipline, but just trying to keep my flight under control when the DI was not around. And I have a story where I don't have a lot of rhythm, and I had to march them to Chow Hall. And as you march and you come up to the end of the marching, there's a cadence you have to call to stop them in time, and there was a wall. And all the other flights would do it right, and I would come in and I would misdo it, and the flight would actually start piling up against the wall, marching in place. It looked like a scene out of like the guys on the bridge from the Wizard of Oz, the big soldier rolled back and forth, and everybody make fun of me. I finally got it down, but I was challenged rhythmically. Let's just say it that way.
So once you were done with training, were you immediately deployed to the Philippines, or was there a couple other steps in between?
No, from there I actually went up to Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas, for training as a medical corpsman. And I was up there actually for a few months. I think we were there, and we learned, all different aspects of the medical field, at least most of them, not some of the stuff that I was going to come across later. And it was really interesting. I really started to get into it, like I can do something else besides being a football guy, so I just really embraced it and stuff. And but I was still very competitive. And at the end of the training, right at one of our final exam thing is a triage, where they put us inside of a hangar, and then they have all these different airmen and laying out on the tarmac, and they have all these prosthetic injuries, and we have to make a decision as to, okay, how you do this one, save this one. This one's an evisceration. You let this one go. And I went through it, and I won it, and I got them all right, and I was so proud of myself. And then the drill instructor, the person running the training, he came up to me, and he was really upset with me afterwards, because even though I had treated everybody correctly to save, the ones that I couldn't save with the eviscerations, I didn't take the time to leave them the morphine packets. So it was something that didn't really hit home at the time about the compassion for life, because I really hadn't experienced death, and to me it was just like a competitive thing. But it's something that kind of stuck in my subconsciously about being more compassionate about life and that whole process. So that was kind of a beginning awakening for me about, thinking about what I was going to be as far as a corpsman.
So were you planning at this point, based on the training, to be a combat corpsman?
Well, that's what, I thought. I was 20, 21 years old, right? So you're sitting there, and that's what you want. It's the end of Vietnam, so there's not like a lot of combat going there. But there's tactical hospitals that would rotate out to different skirmishes, humanitarian efforts, and that's where I was being trained for, and I assumed that's where I was going to go ahead and go and what I was going to do.
Right. So then you get deployed to the Philippines, correct?
Yes.
And what did you think you were going to be doing when you got sent there?
Well, when I went there, I thought I would be assigned to one of the tactical hospitals. There was 656 and 657th, that you would work in a hospital with a regular job of some kind, and assisting in the medical wards or orthopedics or whatever. But then you also were assigned to one of these tactical hospitals that would train and rotate out to different things. When I came in there, that wasn't the case. The day I reported with another airman, and we went to the personnel sergeant, and he's sitting there doing a bunch of stuff with his paperwork, and there's a big board behind him, and I didn't realize at the time, but there was two openings. There was one in a general ward, and there was another one underneath this category that said OB, which I had no clue what that was. Well, the corpsman I was with kind of looked at that real quick, and he asked this guy, he goes, could I be assigned to the general ward? And so he goes, yeah, for sure. And he goes, then you have OB. And I'm just going, yeah, you're just a fresh, trained guy. But then I stood up, and then before I go, sir, what's OB? And, and he goes, it's third floor, I forget what it was. He goes, it's obstetrics. They have an opening in the newborn nursery. And, I'm 6'5", 235 pounds, and I was strong. Not like now, but I was really strong then. And I was just like, I was really respectful to him, but I was like, oh my God, I just didn't want to do it. I remember riding up in the elevator thinking, how do I transfer out of taking care of babies? I don't want to take care of babies, So that's how I am. That's how I came into the Philippines.
But then you got up there.
I got up there, and as going to the very beginning, when I came out of the elevator and I came around the corner, there was Captain Fanny Gaines, who was in charge of the whole obstetrical unit, and then there was another officer next to her, Lieutenant Lynn Foose, who was a second lieutenant, and they were standing side by side down by the newborn nursery, and I could hear the kids wailing and all this. But they're officers, and I'm just coming out of training, so I'm like, I salute them and everything, and I'll never forget. Captain Gaines looks me up and down, and she goes to something to the effect of, I requested 2 corpsmen, and they send me one big one instead. So I, ended up getting a little bit of training and then going there, and then it was just a whole different experience for me.
So what were the duties?
The duties, no pun intended with the word duty, okay, but initially I just worked as helping, change diapers and feed babies, maybe take them out to the mothers for nursing or whatever, general house cleaning. I also had to wash the bedpans, from the obstetric wards. We had all that stuff, and I was just there like livid. This is not what I wanted to be, and I tried to go down to see if there was any openings, anything else, and never to be. I was staying there, and then something happened, and I'm not even sure exactly, but I just started becoming more curious. We had a few incidents with premature babies being born or being brought in, and it was incredible. an intense time about, trying to save them the first few days, making sure that they kept breathing. And I started to help with that quite a bit, and I became fascinated by it. And I started studying medical books on it and stuff. And the staff, Captain Gaines then, Lieutenant Foose, and the resident pediatrician, they started letting me do more and more duties with that because we were limited staff-wise too. So I just got really, really big into the intensive care side of taking care of the little tiny preemies.
What were some of the more common things you did to care for those in intensive care?
Yeah, and as time went by, I got more comfortable doing more things. Some of the basic things we would watch the heart monitors, the levels of their oxygen that they were taking in, and different things. But one of the most common things with premature babies is their brain stems are not developed that much, to where their respiratory system, just to breathe on their own, that sometimes they basically, for a better way of saying it, they forget to breathe. So you have to go over and flick their foot and hit them and shake them a little bit, so they just kind of there, and the monitor would go off and they start breathing. And as times got busier, it was hard for me sometimes, especially when I was on by myself at night by myself. I'd have like 6 well babies to take care of, and I may have like 3 premature babies. And when the monitor would go off, I'd have to put down the well baby and then run over to the preemie and try to get him to breathe. Well, it became time difficult for me. So what I did is I took IV poles and I strung them out to where the incubators were, and then I took surgical gauze, soft surgical gauze, and I ran it through the IV poles, almost like putting like a lineman as far as telephone things, and I would drop them down inside the incubators through the little hole in the top and tie them gently to the feet of the premature babies. And then if I'm feeding a baby and I'd see the monitor go off and start ringing, I would just see which baby it was, and then I would gently pull on the gauze, and then the foot would rise, and then it'd go off and everything. So I got very creative about how to take care of him, and the resident pediatrician at the time, he saw it, and he was okay with it because it wasn't like I was like jerking or anything. But the charge nurse would go around, and she would get upset. She just didn't like me doing that. But the pediatrician overruled her, saying, what's he going to do? He only has so much time to take it. But I had a good time taking care of. I remember taking my shoes off and just have my socks with Armed Forces radio going on, and I would be sliding from crib to crib, changing them. I got really good at it and just really enjoyed it. I just really was having a great time. Like I'm doing something. I'm more than just catching a football, and it just felt really, really rewarding. That's the best way to describe it.
John, we'll pause right there. We'll be right back with the rest of your story, and we'll talk about Operation Babylift and what followed that for you. Okay. This is Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus, honored to be joined today by U.S. Air Force veteran John McCarney. And for the next several minutes, we'll be talking about Operation Babylift and the impact that those days had on him for many years to come. As you mentioned, you got to the Philippines after the peace accords had been signed, ending the Vietnam War. But of course, the fall of Saigon happened in the spring of 1975. Right. And even before the fall actually completely happened, there was the concern about babies in South Vietnam, particularly interracial babies between U.S. service members and Vietnamese women. And so there was an airline executive that got highly involved with this, and eventually President Ford authorized Operation Babylift. So that's a lot to preface this. So explain what you understood at the time was happening and what the purpose of the operation was.
Yeah, as far as like I said, I got there in 1974, and we knew in the Philippines that Vietnam was really already starting to collapse a little bit. The North kept coming, further south, and in the spring of 1975 is where it really started to fall apart. In late March, they came down, and I think Da Nang fell and everything too, and World Airlines owner, Ed Daly, his daughter was involved in some orphanages there. He was a military contractor for the United States government, and so he took it on himself to save the mixed race infants and toddlers and children, because the word was at the time was that the North Vietnamese could possibly, do horrible things to the mixed race kids that are from the Vietnamese people and the American soldiers. So there was this big panic that set forth, and he along with several other people, there were so many great volunteers that did stuff. There's a guy named Ross Metter who got a Volkswagen van and would pick up the babies from the different orphanages. Leanne Thiemann, she had hid $10,000 of money in her bra. She was going over there to take 6 kids. She ended up getting 300 out. Just an amazing amount of people trying to help the babies, but it collapsed. So once Ed Daly did that flight, and it kind of woke up the world, President Ford authorized $2 million to initiate Operation Babylift, which was to go ahead and bring at least 2,000 of these children to the United States. And so he went ahead and commissioned a C-5A aircraft, among others, to be refitted and to come over. The operation actually launched from our base in the Philippines, Clark Air Force Base, and to go over to Tan Son Nhut and bring the kids. And they set up a tent city, a whole relocation center on our base, in the parking lots and in the gymnasiums, to go ahead and facilitate bringing those kids, prepping them to get them to the United States.
You talk about this in the essay you've written about this. Talk about how huge a C-5A plane is.
The C-5A, I was there, and on our base, we had, F-4 Phantoms back then, B-52 bombers, C-131, C-140s, big cargo planes. The C-5A is enormous. I mean, the best way I described it is like if you felt like an ant, looking up at something. It was just a massive airplane. To give you, I know a detail is, part of this was they were going to resupply, with this plane that was going over to pick up the kids, they were going to resupply the South Vietnamese regular army with 14 howitzers. Those 14 howitzers, big artillery cannons, were loaded on that C-5A, and they dropped those off there, and they loaded up the kids. So I always thought that was an interesting juxtaposition to have these howitzers going off and then having these kids coming out. Like I could almost imagine like a bottle of formula sitting on one of the wheels of the howitzers or something, But that's a very big airplane.
And you mentioned they retrofitted Clark Air Force Base. They also retrofitted the planes.
Yeah,
they
did.
They right?
They had to really because they were cargo planes, and so they had to come up with different ways of having the kids strapped in and everything. And there's some interesting pictures up in there's a passenger section up above in the C-5A. Which looks like a regular airliner almost as far as the way the seats are. But what they did was they took little boxes, and they had all these boxes across the seats, and they'd have all the infants in it, and they would, put a gigantic seat belt across them all to hold them in place. And then the older kids, some of the toddlers and stuff, were in the lower part of the cargo area with different nettings and different stuff. And but so it was, I think there was well over, 200. Well over 200 kids, I think, that were brought in that first flight there. I mean, initially. So.
Wow. We're going to take a break here in just a moment, but as you prepared for this personally, knowing this was coming, what's going through your mind?
Well, that's the thing with me was, I was working in the newborn nursery intensive care side. I was not assigned to a tactical hospital, so I was just working with my kids up there, and there was all this chaos going around in other places, and I felt a little left out of it, to tell you the truth. There was something to where I was kind of not, my role hadn't changed, and other people were. And I was in the ICU nursery and the intensive care nursery, and the intensive care of the hospital was right next to us. So a couple of the medevac guys, the corpsmen that worked in medevacs, would come up from time to time, and I'd talk to them, and they would, take whoever it was over to the intensive care side. They were going to be part of the operation, and others were involved on the tent city. But I was just still taking care of my kids, which I knew was doing an important role, but I didn't quite feel like I was part of it, and so there's a little bit of a different feeling for me.
Well, we'll talk about that a lot more in our next segment, as well as, of course, the tragic beginning of Operation Babylift. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest is U.S. Air Force veteran John McCarney. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos, honored to be joined today by U.S. Air Force veteran John McCarney, and we're talking about Operation Babylift and his service at that time at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. And John, of course, for those who know the story of Operation Babylift, it got off to an unspeakably tragic start. This huge C-5A airplane loaded with kids and Army personnel crashes, and many of them were killed. Take us through the reaction where you were and personally and those around you at that time.
Yeah, just as you said, it was a tragic start to it, and as far as remembering it from my perspective at the time, I remember coming to the hospital in the afternoon and to come to work, and it was just kind of chaos there, and nobody was really sure if something bad had happened, but they weren't sure what. And the base was already set up to start receiving these children from Vietnam, and the C-5A being the very first one. It wasn't the only one. It was many, many more were going to come behind that. And what we got word was that it ended up crashing right after takeoff. And what had happened was one of the main cargo doors, one of the connections on it had kind of buckled, and so once it was up about, I think, 10,000, 20,000 feet, the door blew off. And the whole, and if you think of the big cargo planes with the big doors that open in the back, that's the door that blew off. And a lot of the people that were down below, they actually flew out, and the pressure dropped in the plane, so the mask had dropped down on the kids and the babies and the infant and the sections of the passenger side, and it was just a horrible experience. And from what I found out afterwards, when that door blew off, it blew off some of the hydraulic cables. So Captain Bud Traynor, who was flying the plane, it took every ounce of strength of him to get it to turn around to try to come back to Tanzania to land it, and he couldn't quite make it. And it came down. It first came down right. It bounced, and then it went right over this other river. And then when it went over the second time, it just exploded into 3 different pieces. And a lot of the kids that were down below got killed when on the thing, plus with a lot of volunteers and military people too. A lot of the infants up above were okay, but it had separated into 3 different areas. And the main passenger side, where the infants were, there was the flight nurse was Regina On, and she ended up receiving the Cheney Award for outstanding valor in a humanitarian effort, because she got her back broken on it and a broken foot, and she was still able to, go ahead and direct getting all these infants out, and saved a lot of kids along with a lot of other people, plus the heroics of Bud Traynor to get that thing back the way he did. The unfortunate part is, like, I think 178 people died, with about 70 or 80 children or more than that, and or no, I think it was 138 children. I'm not sure of the exact numbers, but it was just a devastating thing. And for me, it just kind of woke me up, because going back to that incident I said about not giving you morphine to the evisceration in my training, is this brought pain and everything to life to me. The 2 of the medevac guys that would always come up to bring guys, were on that plane, and one didn't make it back, and one got his voice box kind of crushed and stuff, and just all kinds of volunteers, different people that were around the base. Everybody was gone, and it was so unexpected, and you thought we were doing something great here, and it turned into such a tragedy. And I remember there just getting even more and more feeling guilty of, like, I'm just here, and look at these people who perished trying to do this incredible humanitarian effort.
You felt like you should have been there.
I felt I should have been there, and it's funny where especially at that age, I wanted to be, I thought, part, and even though I was really enjoying that, and I know looking back, I made a big difference in those kids' lives, I just felt like I wasn't doing my part, as other soldiers were doing, or as other airmen were doing. I just thought that, I got a kind of a free pass because I'm just here. I'm just in that nursery. So,
do you feel like it hit you harder because of the work you had been doing with babies? If you had had a different assignment, do you think it would have hit you the same?
That's a good question. I never even really looked at that. I do know an emotion that came up later when I came back to the States where it kind of hit me that way. Where when I came back stateside, and I was in Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, and I had my uniform on, and I had there was one of those little tram things, and there was a girl and two guys, young 20s, and we were the only ones on the tram, and she made the horrible comment that everybody heard back then, baby killer, and with me it hit really hard, and I remember just staring her down like and that hit me then like, I'm anything but. And that's the only correlation I put like about how I was like with those babies. But that's the only thing about that. But I'm not sure if I had a different thing, if I would have felt different. But I don't know. I think that connection to those kids, to those babies, was something so special to me. I think that's why it hit me extra hard. So,
as the ensuing flights came in successfully, thankfully, did your role change? Did you end up dealing with those kids?
No, and that's it. See, my thing is everything was that great, effort that was going on, and I was really good with that. And personnel-wise, being limited, I stayed in the newborn nursery because I could take care of the preemies, and I could take care of the regulars one, and I would work at night. I went to the University of the Philippines, so for classes stuff. So I was on at night. Captain Gaines let me go ahead and work the night shift, and that's where I'd be by myself. So I was I would just take care of those kids. That's what I did. That's and that's why. I didn't realize at the time, but I just felt kind of disconnected from it. So,
how many babies were rescued, all told? Do you know?
I think overall, I think with Operation Babylift, World Airways, I think. What's the other airline? I should give them credit, but I forget. But I think it was a total of about 3,000 babies that were brought stateside, and there was different controversies. And then there's also ones that were taken to other countries in Australia. There was a big contingent that went to Australia too, but and a lot of those orphanages and the personnels in those orphanages, they did a lot too to get them to the planes to be able to be brought out.
So you mentioned the guilt that you felt. How did that manifest itself over the rest of your time in the service and even for years to come?
The one time, like I say, when I got after I left the Philippines, and ironically I left on a C-5A. They were grounded for a long time, but when I left, we went, and they were so jittery about it. We stopped in Guam, we stopped in Hawaii, and they eventually changed us to a plane because at that time they weren't sure what the cause was, whether it was some sort of projectile that hit it or whether it was a mechanical problem. But then when I came back, I got restationed at Shepherd Air Force Base again, which was not my favorite assignment. But and then when I came, but that's where I go back and forth on leave. And that's where I had the one incident with the girl and the two guys in the Dallas airport. And the funny thing with that happened was, back then, if you wore your uniform and you go home on leave, you could get standby and you go for free. The airlines would let you. I'm not sure if they still do that or not. But I just stopped wearing my uniform because I didn't want to have people saying stuff. And at the time, my family I'm from Hollywood, California, too. So I just didn't want to deal with it. So I would pay to come home on leave rather than. But that's it. But then when I got stateside, roles changed. I didn't get to do quite as much. And, it was nothing really then came at me like, wow, I feel guilty about that. Just that thing in the Dallas airport did.
And so it was many years later that you finally faced this guilt that you had been dealing with. You describe it in your essay as just kind of a cloud hanging over you. How did that affect your work, your family, all sorts of other parts of your life?
Yeah, with where it really came to I buried it. I mean, the day I got out, I threw away all my uniforms. I didn't want to, never thought about it, never talked about it. A lot of people didn't even know I was in the Air Force, right? And the first thing that happened was my son was coaching baseball in San Diego, California, and we were going down to see a game. So I go down to see him, and after the game, he gives me this package and manila envelope, and it's this Air Force hat, it's this Air Force shirt, and a commemorative coin and a note, and it's from the Air Force baseball coach, and he had never even met me, but he knew I had been in the Air Force through my son, and he just wrote this nice thank you for your service, looking forward to meeting you someday, and it hit me like a ton of bricks after 40 years. It was the weirdest thing, and on the way back up from that, we were going by Camp Pendleton, and I just remember thinking about the Marines and how those guys had all given so much. So many kids had gone through there and lost their lives and stuff, and then here I am, a guy that was in the nursery, and so that's where the guilt really started coming back up again, and I really started thinking about it, and I'd look at the hat. I never wore the hat or the shirt. I just didn't want to do that. And then a little bit more time went by, and what really brought it to fruition was a baseball game, a spring training baseball game, Seattle Mariners against the Cincinnati Reds, and in Goodyear, where I live now, and at the end of the second inning, they always they ask for the veterans to stand to go ahead and honor them. And I was with a group of people from my work, and Jim Guston and his wife, and Mike Chalmers and his wife Linda, and I didn't stand, I get up right away. And Jim goes ahead and goes, Johnny Mac, get up, you got to get up. And it's like, okay. And so I start to get up, and by the time I finally get up, the thing is over, and everybody's sitting down, so I sat down quick, and Mikey was like looking at me like, why, so it really kind of bothered him, I think. And when we had dinner that night, he brought it up again, and I tried to explain it's not like a disrespect, it's just that I don't feel as worthy as guys that were like in combat to be honored and stuff. And then the weirdest thing happened. I just started crying, and it was the weird, I don't even know why it hit me so hard so many years later, and it was like something, and his wife, Linda, was just, she couldn't handle it, seeing this big guy cry and everything, so she goes to me, she goes, John, think about squirrels, just think about squirrels, and it just was the weirdest comment, right? So it just kind of made me stop, and I chuckled a little bit, and I got over it. And then as the evening went by, she talked to me quite a bit, and she goes, you ought to write this down, just get this out so you start feeling better about your, and stuff. And I was like, I don't know, but then it was like kind of a good idea. And so since I grew up in Hollywood, I figure I'll try to write a screenplay, and I actually wrote a really good screenplay. It did well in a big competition, the Nichols competition. But it was more about the whole big events, and I could see I wasn't a hero, so I didn't really write me in there. And so even though I wrote a good thing, I didn't get out my feelings inside, what I had. And so eventually I wrote the essay, which you guys published, thank you very much. And it really helped me get out my personal feelings and the things that I went through and the guilt that I felt. And it's really helped a lot to this day. And I had, there was a former, a couple of veterans really helped me too. A guy named Elvis Lynn Bray, he was a crew chief on some search and destroy and search and rescue missions. And he helps people like with PTSD and survivor's guilt, kind of write things about it and everything. And he just happens to be in a writer group that I was in. So we really hit it off, and he really helped me a lot because he's been through, the thing. And he goes, you served. You have to understand you served. And it started to hit home. And then Ken Burns came out with his Vietnam story. So I went to go see that. Actually, I went to go see it with Ross Metter, the hippie guy I told you about, right? And I'm in the lobby waiting, and there's a guy, and I think his name was Daniel Hernandez. He was a former Marine in Vietnam, and a lot of people were talking to him when a break came. So we just started talking to each other, and he goes to me and he goes, were you in Vietnam? I go, no, I was in the Philippines. And then I explained what I did, and he made a comment that just really helped me too. He goes, and I told him I was taking care of babies, and he goes, well, it makes me feel good knowing that somebody was bringing life into this world while we were taking it out. And when he said that, it kind of made me realize too, and then plus for someone like him to say it that was in combat, So these things just kind of built up, and they're like layers of, the word I was going to just say right now was forgiveness. I think it's just like a self-forgiveness of understanding that, there's nothing to be sorry for. If they would have told me to go, like Elvis told me, he goes, if they would have told you to go on that plane, would you have been on that plane? And the answer is yes. And like he said, there's many missions he came where other guys died, where he's wondered, why did he make it out and they didn't make it out? But it's different for a person, I think, that survived combat and say, but I was not in harm's way. And I think that was the biggest thing that I had to get over to realize I did serve even though I wasn't.
John, we're going to take one more break. We'll be back with the rest of your story right here on Veterans Chronicles.
Thank you.
This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus, honored to be joined today by U.S. Air Force veteran John McCarney. We've been talking about Operation Babylift, the feelings of guilt he felt for decades, and how he's finally resolved that by confronting some of these issues. And we talked about this whole sequence of the shirt and the hat and the coin that you received from your son's friend and the other veterans that have come alongside. All of this is really like in the past 5 years. Mm-hmm. And so describe what it's like after 40 years of feeling this to now go through this process of releasing this and feeling good about your service.
Yeah, it's funny because it was, and it is a process of these last 5 years, and me crying and having Linda say the word squirrels to me to make me just kind of take back, and and the exercise of trying to write it and stuff, and then coming across the other veterans. And I think that's the thing I got out of this the most was, someone like Elvis that was in harm's way, and that he makes sure anybody that he comes across that has any sort of regular feelings, he helps them with it. He's helped me tremendous with it. And, the Daniel Hernandez. So what's happened with it with me is I really do feel like I've done my part for where I was in my life and what the circumstance was. And it's that it's not my idea, there's nothing I can do to say, how do I facilitate this or that? It's a decision I made to go into the service to serve. And I served, and the position that we're put in is all by circumstance, fate and needs at the time. And that kind of hit home with me. And now what's kind of come out of it is different people that are like thinking about the service, or they say something where I would just ignore that conversation. I'll give them my opinion. I'm not going to say it's advice. I had somebody explain that to me the other day. There's an opinion and there's advice. But about how wonderful an experience it was for me going in there and how I became such a better person over time, even experiencing the guilt, even having to go through that. The process of life that I'm here is because of those experiences and that at that time. And there's a place where I regularly go to write, and there's a little barista there, and she was going to go in the military. She's went in the Air Force. She signed up to go in the Air Force, and her mom actually came up to me there one day to thank me for talking to her about the stuff and making her feel good about it, and maybe choose this or choose that. And I had another kid named Fabian Reyes. He really wanted to go in. He didn't look like he was going to get in, and he got in, and then he was so thankful for our conversations. And it just made me feel so good that it's like my experiences, I'm not telling them what to do, but I can give them my experiences and how it's made me such a better person to go through those, even though they may seem like bad things at the time, or you don't have control over certain things. Everything seems to shape who we are to get to this point today. And, writing the essay has really helped a lot of people. A lot of people have really said things, and not just people in the service, just about other issues of how they look back about things that maybe they should have done something different or whatever. And I know after I leave seeing you today that I'll go back out, and if I stop to get a cup of coffee at Starbucks this afternoon, if somebody says the Air Force hat and say, "Did you serve?" I'm going to go, "Yes, I did," and then have a conversation with them, so that's kind of how I feel now. But I do feel way better than I did a few years ago.
Last question. Have you ever heard from one of the babies you took care of?
No, I have the closest I got to that is there's an organization called I'm gonna get the name wrong, but they're a Babylift adoption organization, and it's run by Lana Noon, and I had talked to her, and she actually adopted 2 babies, but the first one, didn't make it, and it came to our base, and we were talking, and she said that that baby was up in the ICU at the time. So, she says that I probably took care of it. So, and that made me like a really kind of a thing in the back of my neck go and stuff. But I haven't talked to anybody or even the other babies that I was at the time, and I'm really curious about that because you do all these life-saving measures to keep them going, and sometimes you got to give them a lot of oxygen, and it can cause blindness, but you have to make that decision. And I just am so curious. I did reach out to a one. Her name is Mai Wong, and she went to Australia with the Babylift, and then many years later she worried about who her mom was, wanted to know. So she went back to find her mom, which turned out not to be her mom, but then she found her real mom, and then the whole experience made her just stay in Vietnam and open up an orphanage. So, but she was amazed at all the different people that are affected by this and the different stories. There's another serviceman named Phil Wise, and he was in that lower compartment when the plane crashed, and he got really severely injured, and he was in our hospital for times, and he was one of the few people from that thing, down below that survived it and stuff. And there's a lot of people out there that have stories to tell about that time that are a lot more potent, I think, than mine.
Well, as one of those other veterans told you, you served. Be proud of it. It was honorable service for sure, and I know there are many families, even if they don't know your name, are very grateful for the care that you gave their babies, particularly those who are in critical condition. So, John, thank you so much for your service, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate the opportunity to get this out. It made me feel better.
Absolutely. John McCarney is a U.S. Air Force veteran, served from 1973 to 1977, reaching the rank of senior U.S. airman, and he was at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines during the critical Operation Babylift. I'm Greg Columbus. This is Veterans Chronicles. Hi, this is Greg Columbus, and thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles, a presentation of the American Veterans Center. For more information, please visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org. You can also follow the American Veterans Center on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at AVC Update. Subscribe to the American Veterans Center YouTube channel for full oral histories and special features, and of course, please subscribe to the Veterans Chronicles podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and please join us next time for Veterans Chronicles.